Yesterday, the speaker of the opening of the conference clearly delineated in many ways what we all have sort of interpreted, that the Intifada in Egypt, the Intifada in Tunisia, is a historical moment, and that it resonates and has resonated consciously and unconsciously throughout the globe. And that is true in the US. And it's true historically that an event in one part of the world, somehow or another, does resonate or transmit to other areas of the world. And that has happened historically. And also has helped to promote other struggles. And I raise this because our panel is contesting the divide, and if anything has been a problem in the US, has been that historically the American public has been conditioned to be divided from the rest of the world, even to think or know or even have an understanding. And many times, the average person does not fully comprehend or have any appreciation of what's going on. But the events in Egypt, the events in Tunisia, the events in the rest of the Arab world has shaken in many ways, and it's inspired people in the US. And I raise this because in Madison, Wisconsin, last year there was a significant labor struggle in which we are in the US beginning to feel the impact of US manifestation of neoliberal economic policy. A drastic enforcement or attempt to enforce a reduction in many of the social progressive reform policies that were implemented post-World War II. And in Wisconsin, the labor unions, the average labor union workers, connected their struggle with Tahrir Square, even though most likely they had no real understanding of what was occurring in this part of the world, and probably shared many of the stereotypical views of the Arab society and customs and world view. Nevertheless, they connected their particular struggle against drastic measures of reduction of their living standards with the struggle in Tahrir Square. So I wanted to just open up with that because I myself have been a labor organizer for over 40 years. I'm of the generation that came after the Vietnam War. I am of the generation that battled against the old, what we call the dinosaurs of the labor officialdom in the US, who all supported the US during the Cold War period, and who made a social contract with the US state of cutting off the working class from any connection with the world arena at the expense of any understanding of international relations at the price of basically economic benefits. So that the working class in the US has had a very difficult, and of course this is not dismissing the influence of the media and everything else that we know of, but from the point of view of the US labor arena, this is a battle that we have contested. Those of us who came of age during the Vietnam War and then joined the labor arena, we have contested bringing in politics into the labor arena. And we have brought up these issues, have fought for it, have contested it, and now, of course, it's taking on a different shape because of world development. But my theme today is about the question of international solidarity, and I phrased it as third world again. And that, of course, refers to the fact that for a long time in the 60s and post the Bandung Conference of 1955, we had a perception of the third world international solidarity framework, and I don't, of course, need to go further and do not have the time to go further on that. But I raise it in a rhetorical sense that given the nature of the struggle that is occurring and hopefully how it develops, it opens up the possibility of of transcending the divide between the U.S. and the rest of the world, and of course, most critically for those of us who are social activists, to be able to develop the critical mass base to be able to affect social and political policies, and also to advance the knowledge and understanding that we had at one time when we were in the struggle against the war, when we were in struggle for civil rights, when we were in struggle for Puerto Rican independence, when we were in struggle for supporting the Palestinian struggle. There was an elementary knowledge of internationalism, even if we did not know all of the specifics and the nuances and the complexities of particular arenas of the world. The Arab revolt, of course, is also has to be seen in the context that we are in a critical crisis of global capitalism. Its impact has torn asunder many of the social fabrics, not only in the nominally third world, but also, as we can see, in Europe, in Greece, in Spain, in France, and even in England. I want to connect the struggle in the Arab world specifically to Latin America, because in Latin America, this phenomenon has also manifested itself in a different form, in somewhat different shape, and maybe not as dramatic as the downfall of Mubarak, but nevertheless as significant. And of course, we know about the development in Venezuela, but also in a number of countries in Latin America as a result of 20 years of International Monetary Fund imposed drastic draconian austerity measures. There's been a reaction, and it has been in many ways in electoral form, but the electoral form flows out of the mass social base of organizing peasants, workers, and even in areas that would be unconventional, like in Bolivia, the coca growers who elected their leader to the president and the first Indian native person to lead Bolivia. Earlier in December, there was a new formation led by, of course, these governments: Bolivia, Venezuela, Peru, Argentina, Ecuador, and of course Brazil. And its concrete objective is to integrate the economic policies of Latin America independent of the U.S. And the U.S. and Canada were not invited. And this is a new formation, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. And it's an attempt to supplant the Organization of American States, which has been dominated by the U.S. And that's a significant potential development, and hopefully will be able to be successful in forming a more independent space from the economic policies imposed upon the continent. The Arab world and Latin America have many similarities in how our histories have evolved since post-colonial development. In the Arab world had Nasser. In Latin America, we had Perón. You had the dictatorships of Mubarak. We had the dictatorships of Argentina. We had the dictatorships of Chile. And we've also had the social democratic rule, which also became the implements for the economic policies as we're living them now. We've also had the U.S. intervention and destruction of revolutionary attempts to transform, whether it was Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, and over here, of course, Mossadegh in Iran. Very similar historical patterns, different attempts to try to create space and break free of economic, post-colonial economic dependency. Nevertheless, today we are in a different phase, and hopefully we are reaching a certain level of historical departure. But it does have historical roots, which I felt that was not sort of addressed. I thought that the remarks sort of seemed to imply that what has happened in the last year came out of nowhere, and actually, as any of us know, this is not true. It germinates from many, many years of struggle. In Latin America, what's going on now goes back to 1980s debt crisis, which was drastic and draconian, imposed by the US. And the struggle to deal with that. I'm going to finish with just basically with that because we don't have much more time. I wanted to go a little more into it, but basically we have seen different periods of attempts to reach cross-border world solidarity, whether it was the Bandung Conference in 1955, or more specifically and more radically, the Tricontinental Conference in 1966 in Cuba, which was very clearly an anti-imperialist forum of connecting the three continents. A full frontal assault was launched against the US labor movement, against the public at home, reductions and drastic reversal of many of the social programs, and continually attempts to do that. Attacks against the New Deal policies that were really revolutionary in many ways of transforming people's post-depression materials factors. And now we are at, we see that this has accelerated even more in the last few years. In our specific case, specifically against what is called the public sector, to attempt to privatize it, which is just another manifestation of the neoliberal economic perspective, drastically reduce the economic perspective of the American working class and the middle class, public sector workers, of which in most of the major cities we're talking about African American and Latino workers. I myself come out of the public sector workers. And in public sector, we're talking about transportation, and schools, and these are the jobs that allow us, post-civil rights struggle, to reach the so-called American dream. And this is now being threatened to be reversed. So I think that we are reaching a possibility of connecting, and it's important, I think, for the American Studies field. I'm not an academic myself, but I think it's important for the American Studies to begin to look at how this is going to connect in the foreseeable future.
Good afternoon. How's everybody? Here, I know it's been a long day. I will be brief. I don't remember exactly what the title I gave Rabab months ago was for my talk, but I'll just call it Notes on Revolution. From an internationalist and abolitionist perspective. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of the Los Angeles Uprising, one that Mike Davis rightly dubbed the first multicultural uprising in the history of the United States, at least if you kind of look across the demographics of the people who expressed their manifest dismay at the world as it had become, and that's what Jaime was just talking about. The immediate cause of that uprising was the acquittal of 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers who had beat the crap out of black motorist Rodney King, and whose deeds circled the globe thanks to the surprising, energetic filming of the incident by a nearby resident, a white working class man called George Holliday. The deeper cause of the uprising was the result of a generation-long counter-revolution coupled with capital flight and both individual and social wage squeezes on the one hand, and the ungloved iron fist to deal with the dispossession and displacements on the other. Again, I'm echoing the people who preceded me on the panel. A generation is a long time, but as C.L.R. James teaches us in his fabulous book, Modern Politics, quote, a revolution takes place because people are so conservative. They wait and wait and wait and try every mortal thing until they reach a stage where it is absolutely impossible to go on. And then they come out in the streets and clear up in a few years the disorder of centuries. The counter-revolution's aim was to obliterate radical organizing, especially Black and other third world peoples in the USA, along with radical, white, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist individuals and groups. They all had long, complicated histories of internationalism, whether as communists, as Pan-Africanists, as parts of revolutionary cadres associated with, for example, the Mexican Revolution. I have a student called Christina Heatherton who's writing a fantastic dissertation about that. Hint. This political natal alienation took many forms and expressions, including, for example, in California, the 1988 general criminalization of young people, especially young people of color, under a law that was entitled the Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act. A moment before the April 29, 1992 uprising began, several hundred people in South Central Los Angeles had just concluded a historic gang truce. In the breach opened by the organized abandonment that characterized post-Vietnam War era Los Angeles, street gangs had reorganized territory and people in sometimes benign, but also, and by the late 1980s and early 90s, often murderous ways. As a result, however, of the extra-legal murder of a former gangster, a one-day truce was established in order to allow the dead man's family from various city territories to attend his funeral. I've written about this day in my book, and you can read about it if you like. But today, I want to emphasize another aspect of that truce. At the funeral, the imam of a local independent mosque invited the gangsters to come to his neutral site in the community that belonged to no gang, to continue the dialogue that had been opened at the funeral, because the funeral had become a political protest. And the expression of antagonism toward the police who had killed the young man produced an opening for the gangsters to explore stopping the work of being unbadged police deputies killing each other. In the course of seeking a language to express what the truth could be, a few of the gangsters, who were also students at a community college, looked into texts that for them adequately expressed the sensibility of irreconcilable territorial and identitarian differences. They read and used a number of United Nations Security Council resolutions written to conclude the Six Days War and the 1973 wars here. But in the course of consolidating and expanding the truth, many people from organizations that had roots in radical struggle came to the table to talk politics with the gangsters. These organizations, sometimes tiny, were composed of people who had not been murdered, who had not been driven into exile or hounded underground by the US counter-revolution. Armenian mentioned COINTELPRO. They might be dissembling, but they were still there. And new formations suffering under the same weight of criminalization and constant hunting influenced the development of political consciousness taking place there. Thus, the imam was joined by people who had been members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the Communist Labor Party, the Black Awareness Community Development Organization, which was founded by a Black man who had converted to Islam while in prison, but also the struggles of the Los Angeles Eight. 7 Palestinians and a Kenyan married to one of the 7 were also brought to the discussions. As a result, the template for the truce derived from the UN Security Council, while never actively disavowed to my knowledge anyway, was superseded by an internationalist sensibility concerning the dispossessed, settler colonialism, and difference. From the Imam, they learned that the Prophet teaches that God created difference so we might get to know one another, that difference underlies what should be the social rather than what is, racist ethnic cleansing. Thus, the infrastructure of feeling that made possible this peace was actually, in the longer term, an internationalist political sensibility, the foundation, for example, of the Black radical tradition, as Cedric Robinson teaches it to us. And in my view, it shaped the possibility for national gang convenings that followed this truce and other truces, and the deep decline in intra-national warfare between and among the dispossessed. And it opened the possibility for looking beyond. So the gangs, having repurposed a document that seemed to give them the foundation for a certain kind of peace, through political engagement with longtime activists, redefined what peace should be. Not in a progress to liberalism, but in the movement to renovate and make critical already existing activities, as Gramsci teaches us, in order to remake the world where they live. What they did, for me, the infrastructure of feeling consists of, was to select and then reselect their ancestors, to take Raven Williams' idea of tradition down to the ground for a look at it. In so doing, they realized how their lives, while circumscribed by the territorial boundaries established through warfare and policing, were not so local as one might imagine. By circulating back into the southern United States, where many of their parents were from, and through prisons to which they had been condemned many times, prisons which, although becoming steadily blacker, were and are, more than anything, places where millions of modestly educated women and men, mostly of color, spend part or all of the prime of their life locked in cages. They came to acknowledge and represent the acknowledgement of things that they in some ways already knew, but had not had the language to speak. In other words, they repurposed their purpose, and in doing so enabled a renovation of the remnant organizations of which I spoke. Meanwhile, what? So this was 1992. Meanwhile, the Contract on America took a bipartisan project, which was mass incarceration, a bipartisan project from day one, and made it the explicit platform that conjoined racism and its partial undoing through law to a means, through law, to redo racism. Newt Gingrich taught his acolytes, quote, "You favor a political revolution. You want to replace the welfare state with an opportunity society. You favor workfare over welfare. You want to lock prisoners up, and you're actually prepared to give up some political pork barrel to build as many prisons as you need," close quote. And let me remind you that the people who came into that Gingrich revolutionary cadre in the early 1990s had to memorize this stuff. They recited it to each other. So this is not just some little bit of ephemera, but the guy who's now the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States memorized this, committed this to heart when he was an early member of the Congress. While mass incarceration was already underway in the 1980s, as child poverty increased and still increases in the US, in the 1990s, mass incarceration took yet another leap. In this century, mass incarceration and the longest wars in US history shaped consciousness in many ways, but mostly what they do together is to expose people to group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. The underlying and renovated organizing that the gang truth story is an example of, rather than the cause or heart of, continued to gain strength and direction over those same 2 decades, with a concept, abolition, leading at an edge. So not the edge, but an edge. For abolitionists, freedom remains on one, not only for the descendants of African slaves, but for all dispossessed people. By organizing around mass incarceration and immigrant detention, we try to connect struggles waged against settler colonialism for the ability for all people to organize themselves to win equality, which is not the we're leaderless, we're not institutionalized, comes from the way they've kind of absorbed the media representation of Arab Spring as something that's wholly spontaneous. That nobody had a thought, and then one day everybody was in the square here, in the square there, in the square everywhere, doing, making revolution. The latter, that they're non-leader, is not quite true. As I said, and the former is worrying. For example, when the General Assembly at the Wall Street liberation began to convene, people who have been traveling the uprisings and the experiments in alternative self-governance noticed the presence of other people who had spent a lot of time in the fabled El Alto in Bolivia, learning there how to lead by obeying. And these people then taught General Assembly facilitation to the people who were liberating Zuccotti Square in New York. That makes them leaders of Wall Street, even if they're not the bosses. And that distinction is one worth reflecting on. But I also worry that the refusal to make demands is an uncanny echo, a not repurposing of the anti-state state that similarly refuses the vision of well-being or welfare that is the ne plus ultra of equality writ large. I worry as much as anybody does about how the revolutions in North Africa and West Asia will resist the blandishments of a neurotic culture, as George Kent brilliantly said of Richard Wright's adventures of Western culture. And certainly the anti-state state form seems appealing because it appears, when not thought through, to be the antithesis of authoritarianism rather than what it really is, and that's the disguise through which growing U.S. Authoritarianism is perfected and also cultivated abroad. So I just want to close with a thought about my favorite American studies thinker and writer, and that's W.E.B. Du Bois. In his great book, Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, Du Bois did kind of everything that American studies is supposed to do and more. First of all, it's an interdisciplinary work. He was a sociologist by training, and he sat down and wrote a history because he was not satisfied with all of the histories he read. And in writing a history as a sociologist, he came up with a number of ways to understand what had happened to that moment, that opening of liberation, that radical reconstruction after the U.S. Civil War consisted of. And in a footnote in that book, he writes that the experience of the Negro worker under Reconstruction presents the researcher with the opportunity to study the Marxist theory of the state inductively. Whether or not one wishes to study the Marxist theory of the state, I think that the uprisings that have happened in the US and abroad, some of which have gotten more press than others, including in Martinique and Guadeloupe some years ago, that resulted in significant changes in labor relations in gives us the opportunity not only to use, to exercise our theoretical chops and think deductively about what connects with what and why, but also perhaps to drop down to the ground and consider in a careful inductive manner how it is that an internationalist sensibility is still at work and how we might help connect that across space and time. Thank you.
Functioning. So if you would like, please ask questions, but please project your voice when you do so. And what about one of you calling people, or you guys call?
First of all, thank you everyone for a very stimulating session. There's a lot to think about. My question is for Manami. I really appreciated your point about co-opting the Muslim leadership and inviting people in so that you can kind of control the discussion in a sense. And I identify with that very much. We were talking about the same ideas in terms of artists accepting government funds and how that might encourage them explicitly or implicitly to change their tone, change their message. My question is, I feel like a lot of people in marginalized communities would agree with this statement. I wish my government understood, paid attention to, had a dialogue with, took consideration of my community more. So at what point do we want outreach and interaction? At what point does it become problematic? How do we negotiate that difficult terrain?
Sure. So that's been a long-standing debate, I think, in various issues and struggles everywhere. And I know it's still contested to this day in New York. We're part of a number of Muslim civil rights coalitions, and there's always those opposing sides. And one way that I have seen it play out is that that our communities are the non-monolithic character of our communities, particularly in terms of class, often gets sidelined. And so, at least in New York City, with such a large Muslim population and lots of low-wage Muslim workers, working class youth that are very disenfranchised, that are not going to college, that are doing low-wage jobs, there's often a very stark difference between that base of people and leadership, who often tend to come from a more middle-class elite background in terms of the strategy of change and how to deal with, the government and with people in power, and what needs to be done first and second. I was on a panel recently talking about the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and almost every single person on the panel next to me who were movement leaders in this work for 10 years, almost all of them said, we're done with protesting. We're tired of being on the outside now. Now it's our turn in the next decade as Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians to be within the system. And that's how we're going to change things. Well, the reality is, in our communities with thousands of people who are still undocumented, still low-wage workers, that's not what they're thinking is the strategy we need to take on right now. So I think there's some of that difference, but that's not the only answer. But I think it's a fundamental difference in, what is organizing strategy, what is strategy to confront the state versus sort of pleading with the state, and what makes sense when. But one thing that I think is a principle that many of us have stuck to is that if you're going to negotiate with the same people that are still disappearing, incarcerating, and waging war on your communities, there has to be an outside strategy as well. Otherwise, we have no power. But if there's no outside strategy, no way to hold these people accountable for what they're doing with the other side of their mouth, then it absolutely works against us to just have that strategy of trying to deal and cut deals with them.
Yes.
My question is also for Manami and for a comrade from San Francisco. I forgot what your name is. I'm sorry. So I mean, I'm a South Asian American myself, and oftentimes when people talk about this issue of complacency from people who are brown and in America, I mean, my question is, I guess, the thing I think I'm thinking to myself is, where are all the people who are a little bit louder? This is my first time in Lebanon, and I've noticed that with groups that represent underprivileged, like sects and ethnic groups here, there's no question of where they are. They're everywhere. You can go to Dahir and see all the flags, and you can see they have a media office. Everything's very well organized, and it's very loud and clearly pressures the state. What do we have to do in the United States to make Muslim, Arab, South Asian American voices, Black and Hispanic voices loud without making them complacent? Like, what do we have to do to rattle the beast? Yeah. Question.
I think there are other folks on the panel who could speak to it. Well, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things you can think of. I think one thing that speaks to me from what you said is that something that's really alarming to me is that in the decade after 9/11, there are still almost no mass-based organizations of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian folks, particularly of working class and poor people, who bear the brunt of these policies. We still have a force where it's, top-down policy, Washington DC driven. But I think my personal opinion is that I think a lot of that has to do with the nonprofit industrial complex created in the US in the last 30 years or so, for particular reasons, to put a cap in different ways, and to create and encourage and actually coerce legitimate ways of organizing, or legitimate ways of grievance, versus the illegitimate ones where you're then called a radical and locked up. I think many things have happened with Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians that I would think there's more of a mass, critical mass, we see more like protests in the streets. That hasn't happened as much, but I think that there's a lot of forces at play preventing that from happening. And we have a long way to go to really build a broader consciousness and to move our people to be on the streets, because there's a lot of talk in New York about how we don't do that because there's so much fear of repression. But what I keep hearing from our members, undocumented women, some of whom, like Rabab, you've met and seen them, Muslim women who are the first ones to say, I've lost my husband already, I've lost our home already, I've lost my job, my son's called a terrorist, what else do we have to lose? We want to be out there. And so I don't think the will is not there, particularly in the most marginalized people, but I think it's very controlled by institutions.
Is saying, I think there is a couple of things additionally to the mind. One is, I think that the grassroots organizing that takes place does not get reported. I mean, this is one of the things, it doesn't get reported. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and then things blow up, and then people say, oh, what happened? Well, Azizi burned himself. There's a lot of stuff going on, accumulative stuff that's going on for a very long time, and then something happened and it explodes. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I think in general, Arab and Muslim communities, I would say, we still have not figured out, or maybe recognized that we are part of specific communities. People still kind of under the delusion that they are part of the white hegemonic established Americanness. And they keep trying, and they don't get convinced that it's not working, it's not going to work. People who've been in the US for a very long time, and I'm not talking about the indigenous communities to whom the land belongs, but I'm talking about immigrants who've come. They've tried also. I'm like, how much Obama has to do in order for him to be actually acknowledged as a president. This is just like one small example. So there is all these issues that have to do with alliance building, has to do with the politics of the country, has to do with the ways in which people in the US still benefit from the pillage of the rest of the world. So I think some of these things are still going on, that also in addition to everything that Monami has mentioned.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment to Melissa. Thank you very much for great presentations. I just heard a program once on Al Jazeera about using the term Palestinos in Cuba, and it was slightly derogatory, actually. You said that it wasn't, but they were referring to people who had moved from the countryside to Havana, and they were calling them Palestinos. So it was just a comment, on what you mentioned. But I wanted to relate to what, and nobody made the comment during the keynote speech by Rami Khouri about trying to show that the process in the Arab world is basically the same as what was happening in terms of applying principles in North America. And he even mentioned, it took 190 years or so to solve the problem of slavery and the problem of the native people. The native people were exterminated, 20 million of them or something like that. And the problem is no longer there. So, and I don't know how that problem was solved. But I'm just wondering, my question to all of you is the sympathy that you see because of consistency of principles with what is advocated as the principles of the US and Western culture of democracy and so forth. There is obvious sympathy with Arab uprisings or intifadas, as you call them. But how do you translate that to actual practice more, and also consistency to apply it to the Palestinian situation? I mean, I think you have to do a lot of work to apply that. You know, if you want to be consistent, this is how you be consistent with your principles. You have to apply. I'm just wondering what kind of thing can be done to make that sympathy, if it is genuine, and doesn't contradict too many things in Western and U.S. culture. How do you translate that to actual real sympathy and application, especially to the Palestinian case?
Can I ask people because Bassel is asking everybody, and like make a note of it, because there's two other people.
Okay.
We can see if if these questions relate to that,
Yeah.
and then so we can save time. Okay, so I have Hazim and I have Jennifer. Yeah. Right.
So my question is kind of about the university. I know there's panels on it tomorrow, but just because there's this mix on the tape, I guess there's some of us who are sort of schizophrenic. We have these two lives, one that's inside the university where we're dealing with text and writing and laptops and things, and then another life that's outside of the university that you have to sort of juggle both. That's more about kind of the real world in a sense. And we sort of switch in and out of both of them, and they inform each other in some ways. And then you have people who are not in the university who are doing very important work, and then they're having to come up with their own research to support their own work and teach themselves how to do the research, et cetera, et cetera. My question is also to all of you, in a sense, because you sort of bridge various experiences. How do you hold the university accountable? And I guess it also follows up on the comments that were not made yesterday. How do you hold the university accountable, whether as an academic or not? Have you, with all of your experiences, have you found ways where what activists really need can set a research agenda? Usually when they have meetings here, for example, for setting a research agenda, the community is represented by people who are spat on in the community, right? Like it's sort of gatekeepers from big NGOs, it's this and that, and it's people like you wouldn't even want to be in the same room with, right? And they're there representing the Palestinian refugees, and this is what research we need. So I'm just wondering what kind of, I know all of you probably have experiences on this, and it'd be great to hear some.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is for Melissa Garcia, specifically. I really liked your attempt to kind of re-theorize the border. And I wondered if you thought about this idea of invisible borders to take your work somewhere else. And let me just illustrate that, what I mean by that, with 3 examples. One is the US Homeland Security and Patriot Act. This idea that now suspect terrorists, whether they're real terrorists or not, whether you can make that distinction, cannot even get on planes to go to the US. So it's a border that's outside of the US, one example. The second example, the Mexico border is now policed where there isn't a wall by unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, right, from the air. So it's not physical. You made this great comment about its, the concreteness of the wall is something, but it's much more than the physicality. So there's the non-physical element about these borders. A third example, abduction, disappeared peoples. For example, Caldera on the border, as I'm sure you know a lot more about than I do. Disappeared peoples. The assassination yesterday of the nuclear physicist in Iran. These people, some of the things happening in Pakistan. So these are ideas that there are borders that are not at the border. They're invisible borders, borderless borders, if you will. So I love your examples of these, and they're great. I see lots of similarities, but also there's other non-physical, otherworldly borders that help you think about borders.
First of all, I really wanted to appreciate the panel in crossing many borders, not only geographical borders, but also borders of academia and activism. And that is very, very important in my view. I'm trying to formulate the question that I want to ask still in my head, and I don't know whether it's going to make sense or not, but I guess it's a question that has to do with the identities that you're pretty much talking about, Arab, Muslim, South Asian. I'm wondering where would we fit an atheist South Asian or a Middle Eastern or whatever. I'm wondering how would we fit a Christian, Jew, Arab into this configuration, and this is not at all a criticism on the side of the panel, but a kind of an awareness, a kind of a void in terms of lack of a way of expressing these identities that is inclusive of the totality and the diversity that exists within what you're talking about.
Okay, so no more questions. I only have 5 minutes. I'm going to who do you want to start with?
I don't mind. Thank you all for coming, for staying, for being cold in here with us. I have a thought about identity and a thought about university, and actually a thought about something. One of the problems that I'm constantly wrestling with as a political activist with a PhD with a job in university is the problem of how readily, especially in the US, but maybe abroad, people try to, sort of fix a category that's the key category for analysis and action.
Right.
And certainly, the problem of diversity falls into that. Again, in US universities, and I can't speak to, that's the only place that I've taught, and this connects to the university question. And one problem that I see, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, is that at least in the university context, but I also think that in many ways in the shape that social justice organizations take, whether they're top-down, not-for-profit industrial complex organizations or bottom-up grassroots organizations, is that they define themselves in terms of one of those identities. Because there seems to be this imperative for the recognition of diversity, which has come in a way to trump equality, which is really what the point of the struggle is. So I'm not saying that these categories and identities and so on and so forth are not important, real, and need to be taken into account, but I do think that there is a really fundamental, profound displacement from equality to diversity, and the way that you see it manifest in US universities is the way that diversity is the business of the student affairs office, right? Everybody gets their own assistant dean, right? And that's what happened when we lost the culture war, and teaching people ethnic studies, let's say, became this, here's something to dip your toe into before you go to Wall Street and try to get rich, even though only 10 people get those jobs. But then the diversity thing trumped equality. There's nothing about equality other than everybody equally gets their assistant dean. So that's the problem. And then to go to the research issue, I just, to be anecdotal, but remember anecdote is the singular data, okay? So anecdotally, before I went to school to do a PhD, I was working with an organization. I was had a fancy education already, and the women in the organization said, Ruthie, you know big words, you're not afraid of libraries, go find the sex rest. And so I'd go find it out. And that turned into weekend workshops with this grassroots organization. Eventually, that also became the dissertation that became my book, but that had nothing, the dissertation and book were not even remotely in my mind when I started the work. And, there are all kinds of people who are sort of laced throughout universities who do various versions of participant action research in which they take direction from the grassroots. And if the grassroots can't get through the door, then people go out the door and find the folks who need to be found, rather than wait for whatever. So that's one thing. And then finally, Blossom, I don't know if it's sympathy, really.
I did
sympathy is like the condolence card, which is, real and heartfelt, but there's some something like this that I think perhaps you're asking us to think about, that I think we're all trying to think about it. So, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Khadijah's last comment. It's not a question of sympathy, and you can't expect really sympathy from the U.S. public either. It's really going to be shaped by material circumstances, how they begin to weigh their interest in relationship to what is occurring. And I remember when I first started organizing as a labor activist, and an old-time labor organizer told me, if you're dealing with a historical background of so many misconceptions, so many biases, and if you think you're going to get to the point where you're going to only deal with pure, unfettered, and uninterested individuals, you'll never get anywhere. And that has been our dilemma. It is circumstances like this, or for example, during momentous developments at particular moments in the U.S., for example, the civil rights movement, Vietnam period, were momentous developments which opened up new ways of thinking and expanded and broke down certain biases and prejudices, but we still have the historical legacy of the colonial history of the U.S., the racial dimensions, prejudice, and class division, which of course is the unspoken word. Okay, very unmentioned and definitely downplayed. The fact is that up until the Vietnam War, which is really a departure from World War II to Vietnam, the U.S. predominant economic influence and benefit in the world was able to materially modify the U.S. working class and public at large, and keep them from being able to identify or understand or comprehend or support other struggles. Specifically, the Palestinian question, I don't think we need to further expand the overall difficulty with the influence and impact and relations and interests, but it's also the fact that that is an issue that is very much out of the mainstream of the U.S. public, other than when they hear this particular incidences. I mean, even today, it's still the image of the Palestinians that they're terrorists. And it's still the predominant perception among the American public and American working class is, as it's projected to them, so that it's been a difficult battle to bring this issue. And of course, the question of Zionism, the influence of the Zionist political interest in the U.S., which is also very reflected in the U.S. labor movement, by the way, if you're not aware of that. The AFL-CIO, even its most progressive, communist-founded organizations, including my union, all continue to hold Israeli bonds in the total ignorance of the workers. And that, of course, is part of the strategic compromise that they made with the U.S. State Department post the witch hunt in the 50s. But there is moments, and there is a break. There is, for example, I forget the specific example, but there was a recent thing where AIPAC, because of last year's uprising in the Arab world and the economic crisis in the U.S., did tell Congress to pull back on some appropriation because they felt that it would raise alarms, that it would draw too much attention to Israel at a time that the U.S. Is carrying severe cutbacks in U.S. cities. So this is where I think U.S. material interest will determine real solidarity.
I agree.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, addressing some of the things that have been said. And following on what Jaime said, I I do appreciate bringing us back to the material, right? Because that is, we can talk about many things, right? But then the reality is that, for instance, when we're talking about the so-called Occupy movement in the US, right? There are many questions that we can raise about what are the demands. The demands are bringing me back what I owned before, or the demands, you know, are that narrow, or the demands, or this is an opportunity by which the particularities that Ricky was talking about, right, can actually seize the moment and bring these ideas towards a more, you know, more, a matrix, if you like. And the matrix, of course, in my opinion, is US imperialism, right? Because then we have the economic imperialism, right? The ideological imperialism, political, and then the whole apparatus that sustains that, right? That has been sustaining that. And that it's a way, I mean, theoretically, we can see it as a very refined way of looking at an overlapping, successive sort of set of occupations, right? Like if we go back historically, right? Or if we go back to the 20th century, to some of the examples that have been brought here. So in that sense, I just wanted to make a point that is very, I think it's important, and it relates to the idea of how do we hold our universities accountable, right? And I think that's, I mean, there are many ways, and depending on how much access you have, I never believe in those formulas, but I do think that maybe in the realm of teaching and scholarship and communicating and conversations, right, and pushing for certain types of dialogue to be at the front, right? One of the things that I found very useful when we're talking about US imperialism, and I think that some of the questions already suggested that, is that schizophrenic contradiction that the so-called rule of law in democracy brings. When we have what is legal, like all those, you know, passing through the border through Israel, all that is legal, right? All that is in the name of so-called security and democracy and to have peace. So much so that within those very same categories of empire where Israeli scene is defined as the only democracy in the Middle East, right? But that all is, as we say, schizophrenic, because when we look at all the illegal, you know, activities that are done within the US and abroad, then the whole idea of democracy has nothing to do with how the law is implemented. So bringing up these contradictions that are so, that sometimes in informal conversation we say, yes, when you raise the question about sympathy, I was thinking, I hope you're not thinking that we are emissaries of the State Department, because, you know, because that's not what we're thinking about. I know that you are not, but it's very important, right, to be critical on the way in which we cannot take at face value these ideas about democracy as if, yes, we have democracy, but we have segregation, discrimination, exploitation, right? No, they're all part of the same matrix, right? And I think that it's important as scholars, and not just scholars like in the traditional sense, but scholars in a more, like an organic intellectual, right? The social justice, right? But that kind of knowledge that goes beyond the classroom, but it's still knowledge. Because I think that we have to fight to make that type of knowledge accountable as knowledge, not as community. Those divisions, right? They are obstacles, and I think that at this point we know enough to know that. So, and just to wrap
I'm
up,
sorry, we really have to set up for the next event. So,
I only have two things to pass.
1 minute.
1776 is our 1948. I think we need to remember that. APAC is normalized as part of the US domestic, but then they do foreign, but we don't question that. So we need to think about that. For hazard, a couple of things. The university is not the radical place that is portrayed to be, and community needs to hold the university accountable, because the university and scholars, we make our bread and butter. All the lives of our community, so the communities actually need to hold us accountable. For surely, I think we can only make alliance on basis of justice. If we think about indivisibility of justice, we don't have to erase who we are, but we can come together in tolerance and respecting each other, and really for human beings.